there. I am glad you can make it today. Our lesson comes from the book of Ruth, and this is one that's real interesting because it's kind of the story behind one of the more famous people in the Old Testament, but you don't find that out until the end. And the way this happened unfolds very nicely. So I'll start right into it. Now, the beginnings of this story had to do with Naomi and her husband and two sons. And there was a famine where they lived. And where they lived was the town of Bethlehem, which you may have heard of before. In any event, because of the famine, and this, of course, means there was no food, it was probably caused by a drought, um, they left Israel and went into the country of Moab. Now, Moab really wasn't that far away by distance. It was located along the eastern side of the Dead Sea, and where they lived in Bethlehem was not too far from the Dead Sea, kind of to the northwest. But it was a very big distance when it came to the type of people they were around, because really the Israelites were not supposed to mingle with the Moabites. They certainly weren't supposed to marry them, but that's exactly what Naomi's sons did. They found these two Moabite girls and married them, and things seemed to be okay as the next 10 years passed. Except something happened. Um, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, okay, and then each of her sons dies. Well, that was a really big problem in those days because uh, that made her a widow. Naomi is a widow, and she has nobody to take care of her. And that was not safe at all for a woman who had no male relative to help watch over her. Plus, there were certain problems with being a foreigner in a different country. So she decides she's going to head back. Well, one of the other traditional things of that time was that when a man and woman married, the woman tended to leave her family and go with the man and his family, and the man would stay with his family and work the same profession. But since both of the sons have died, you would think that would cause a change. But no, both of these girls are going to go with their mother in law as she headed back to Israel. Well, Naomi tells both of them three different times, no, no, you should go back to your father's house. Um, that would be the best thing for you. And then maybe, well, of course, you'll be protected there, and then maybe you'll be able to find another husband. That's really the best thing. Well, one of the women, Orpah, decides to take Naomi's advice. And really, that was the smart thing to do. But what we find is that the other daughter in law, Ruth, goes through a fourth time and says, no, I'm going with you. And you think, that's not smart. Well, maybe it's not smart, but it's faithful because she has learned about the real God and she wants that. She doesn't want to give that up. And she wants to go with Naomi. She loves her mother in law and she wants to go along. She says, your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. And Naomi cannot refuse her at this point. She's like, okay. Well, they head back to, well, for Ruth, this is her first time to Bethlehem, but they head back. They go to Bethlehem and people see Naomi and they go, oh, what has happened to her? Because she is so affected by having her husband and her sons die. They can just see it by looking at her. Well, they're also in a tough bind, even though they still own land there. But what are they going to do with it? Well, they find a place to stay, and of course there are some relatives who still live in that area, and Ruth goes out to glean in the fields. And you go, wait, what is this gleaning in the fields thing? In Israel, they had this great law that people were to follow. And when they would plant their crops, they would cast the seed out onto the land and it would grow where it would grow. Well, if you had kind of a square shaped or rectangular shaped field, the parts in the corners, you were not supposed to harvest anything that grew in that area. That was for poor people to have. That way, anyone who had nothing would not starve to death, but be able to find something to eat. And there was a second part to that where when you sent your people through to pick the crops, anything that they dropped had to stay there. Anything that they overlooked would have to stay there, and the poor people would be able to go in behind them and pick that up and have something to eat. So a very good rule to help take care of people who had nothing. And at this time of year where they have gone back or gone to Bethlehem, it's in the spring and the barley harvest has come in. Now, barley is a type of grain similar to wheat, but it's the kind that's thought of as poor person's food because people who had money would tend to want to have the wheat. But barley will keep you alive, and it was it was good to eat. So it may not have tasted as good, but it was good for you. So Ruth goes to glean in the fields, and she happens upon a field that's owned by a guy named Boaz. And she's working real hard with that. And Boaz shows up a little bit later and says, "Okay, who's that?" And somebody tells him, "Oh, that's Ruth. She is Naomi's daughter-in-law." And he goes, "Oh, she's one of my relatives then." And he says, "Okay, if she does something wrong, don't say anything to her. Just let her pick where she picks." And he said, "What can you tell me about her?" And he said, "Oh, she's a hard worker. She doesn't stop for anything." He says, "Okay, go ahead and put some stuff extra down so that she can pick it up. And I know she'll be taking care of Naomi with this, so this is my way of helping." He's kind of thinking that to himself. But he's telling them to leave out some of this grain and also let her drink from the water jar when she's thirsty. Well, she works a full day, and then um, he has her come to him at the end of the day, and he gives her a lot of extra, and it gets the message to her that don't go to anybody else's field. They may mistreat you there. You come to my field. And so she does that. She goes back to Naomi with all of this barley that's ready to be eaten, and Naomi's surprised because it's so much. And she says, "Whose field were you in?" And Ruth says, "Oh, it's a fellow named Boaz." And Ruth gets excited about this and says, "Oh, he's the kinsman redeemer." Well, there was this other kind of rule involved that if a man were to die and he didn't have any sons to carry on the family name and to inherit the property, then his younger brother was supposed to marry the woman and have a child in the brother's name. Well, of course, that brother had died, and from there, when you run out of brothers, it went to the next closest relative from there on out. Well, it turns out Naomi's a little bit wrong because the closest relative is not Boaz. There's another guy. But Naomi sets up things so that Ruth will end up marrying Boaz. And Ruth seems to be okay with the idea. She already knows Boaz is a kind man. And he's not even thinking that he can marry Ruth. He's treating her kindly because that's just the kind of person he is. And so uh, Naomi helps steer things along so that it's kind of like Boaz and Ruth both realize that they're interested in marrying one another, but there's one guy in the way. He's actually a little bit closer relative, and Boaz meets with this guy, and apparently uh, Naomi is planning to sell what property she does have so that she can live on it. And he calls this guy in to say, okay, I'm interested in the property, but you're the guy who's closest. You can buy it. Do you want to buy it? And the guy says, oh, yeah, I want to buy the property. And Boaz says, well, Naomi's brought back Ruth, the Moabite, and you'll need to marry her too. And the guy says, oh, well, in that case, no, you take the property because it might mess up the inheritance for my children if I marry her. So they've done everything legally. There are people there to listen to this and say, oh, yeah, we saw all of this happen. So Boaz buys the property. He also gets the right to marry Ruth. And he's happy about it. She's happy about it. And so they marry. Everybody's happy. But that's not the end of the story. What happens after that? They have a child named Obed. That's a son. And then Obed grows up. He has a son named Jesse. Jesse grows up and he has a lot of sons, and the youngest of which is named David. And you may have heard of David, who ends up becoming the king. He is King David to be. And Boaz and Ruth are direct, great grandparents to David. And of all the great things with David, then there's one other thing that we recall is that, wait, one of the descendants from David is Jesus. So even though we start this story out thinking, oh, okay, these are some nice people, at the end of it, we realize this is an important story because it ends up affecting things that no one can even think about or realize are going to happen later on. And the lesson for us in all of this is the same, is that you do like Boaz, you do like Ruth, you follow God, you do the best you can do, you're kind to people, and you have no idea how much of a great impact that's going to be on people long after your time. Okay, with that, I'm going to let you go. I have a tie today with a lady on it. That's to remind us of Ruth. Could remind us of Naomi as well. One of the things I like in this is that no, Naomi starts off very down on things because obviously she's lost her husband and sons, but by the end she is happy again. So I like to remember her too in all of this. Okay, with that, I'm going to let you go, and I hope you'll be back next time. Bye.